Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, and welcome to the Carbaugh podcast, episode number 29. Buenas noches, damas y caballeros, chicos y chicas, niños de todas edades, y bienvenidos a el Carbaugh podcast, número 29. Welcome to everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Carbaugh, and this is the Carbaugh podcast. As always, I so appreciate you joining me, whether you're joining me live or on the replay. I would appreciate you letting me know by dropping an L or the word live if you're watching this live in the comments, or an R or the word replay if you're catching this on the replay. It's always helpful for me to know who's watching this live and who's watching this after the fact. And as always, if you find yourself getting value throughout this podcast, please drop the word value or a V in the comments to let me know that you're getting value from what I'm sharing. And as always, if you like this podcast, click the like button. That helps with Facebook showing this to as many people as possible, and also helps on the other platforms as well, Instagram and YouTube. Very soon I'm going to be live streaming on all three platforms at once. I'm working on getting that set up. I was hoping to have it ready for this week, but I wasn't quite there. So we will be soon live streaming to all three platforms. But for now, welcome to the podcast on Facebook. And then I will repost to the other platforms. Tonight's podcast is titled One Size Does Not Fit All. And you'll see what I had in mind with this as we go through the podcast tonight. This topic, as usual, kind of came to me this week through some challenges that I faced at work, and I'll get into those during the middle of this. I didn't want to make this all about challenges. I didn't want to have this be a negative podcast, but certainly some of the things I will be sharing tonight will be more along the lines of challenges or difficulties. I'm going to try and keep it as positive as possible. This one will go into a little bit more of the challenges that I face on a daily basis as a person with limited vision. I've tried intentionally not to make this podcast completely focused on vision limitations. Tonight's podcast will go into that a little bit more than some of them. Just as a heads up. And if you'll allow me, I'm going to use my phone tonight for some notes that I wanted to make sure I covered. So if I'm not looking at the camera, that's why I'm looking down at my phone, and I will try to look up from time to time. So hopefully you'll give me some grace as I go through that. And then we'll see how long this goes. I may try to respond to some comments live, but if not, I will definitely jump on afterwards and respond to your comments or questions. If you have questions or comments throughout this, please let me know in the comments. It's always helpful and always helps me to know what's resonating with people. Hopefully some of these experiences you'll be able to resonate with, and hopefully in a positive way. But let's dive in here. One size does not fit all. What did I have in mind by that? Well, let's start with talking about Ford versus Chevy or Toyota. In that instance, one size doesn't fit all. Some people drive a Ford, some drive a Chevy, some drive a Toyota. Some of us are hoping for a self-driving vehicle, maybe a Tesla or another self-driving vehicle, so that we can drive and have access to independent transportation. But as we look at Ford versus Chevy or Toyota, that preference is more of a preference for most people. Maybe they grew up on one or the other. But most people who drive one versus the other, it's a preference. Maybe they like certain features. Maybe they just like the way the car looks. Maybe it's based on price. But for most people, that's a simple preference. But again, one size does not fit all. How about, and if you have a preference on some of these, drop that in the comment. Let me know. Ford versus Chevy versus Toyota, or maybe another car brand. How about sorry, I got out of order here. Windows versus Apple. Some people prefer a Windows operating system, others prefer an Apple. I happen to use Windows in my work environment for a number of reasons, a variety of reasons. Part of that is dictated to me by my workplace. Part of it is because of the systems that we interact with, and they play better with Windows versus a Mac. Or how about iPhone versus Android? Again, most of that is a preference for people. In my case, I started out on an iPhone because the accessibility features were better at the time. They were built into the operating system. Android has a lot of the accessibility features now that they didn't have 20 or so years ago. Actually, more than 20 now. No, actually, when I switched to iPhone, it was a little less than 20 years ago, because I had a non-smartphone or a dumb phone before that. But I switched to an iPhone almost 20 years ago now. And at the time, iPhone had a lot of the accessibility features, the zoom and the voiceover that I use were built into the operating system. You didn't have to go download additional apps like you do on an Android. I believe it's still the case with Android. Not that it's impossible for someone with low vision or a vision disability to use Android. It's certainly better now than it was 20 or so years ago. But again, a lot of that is a preference. But some of it is dictated by the apps people use or the abilities or disabilities that they have, and some of the accessibility that's available on each of those platforms. How about, we'll start getting into more things that relate to people with a disability, but cane versus dog guide, sighted assistance, or using what vision a person has. Again, that's somewhat dictated by preference or convenience, but also for some people, they don't have enough usable vision to not have to use a cane or a dog guide or sighted assistance. For those of us who have usable vision, most of us prefer to use what vision we have. Partly as a preference, but partly it just makes sense to rely on the senses and the abilities that we have. It's usually faster and more convenient than relying on one of these other methods that's a little more dependent on someone else or on a guide dog, a dog guide. I try not to use the word guide dog because that is a specific brand. But a dog guide, so you're reliant on another animal or another human being, as opposed to just being able to be more independent. A lot of times it's faster to use what vision you have, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. Um, this brings me to talking a little bit about a variety of different technologies that people with limited vision, because that's where most of my experience comes from, different technologies that those of us with limited vision have found to be useful. I'll share a story about a friend of mine who unfortunately is no longer with us. She passed away several years ago, but she invited me to go to a vision exam of hers. And of course, without the invitation, I wouldn't have been in the room with her. She thought that I had macular degeneration, which is another form of vision loss. And I don't. That doesn't happen to be my diagnosis. Mine is nerve related. I've had a number of people, and for a while I was listed on the prayer list at church as a person with macular degeneration. But nevertheless, she invited me to go with her to this exam. And I happened to pick up on something that one of the assistants mentioned early in the exam. And after the exam with the doctor was complete, she asked me, she gave me the invitation to ask any questions that I might have. And so I mentioned to the doctor, I said, well, the assistant had mentioned earlier in the exam that perhaps different colored glasses would help this friend of mine, Mary, be able to see better. And I asked the doctor if that was something worth her looking into, because she had just gotten a pair of sunglasses, and she went for the very darkest glasses that she could get, thinking that that was going to be the best for her in the bright sunlight. And perhaps it was in certain circumstances, but the doctor said, well, sure, we have some that she could try out and see if different colors make a difference for her. Well, it turned out, unbeknownst to either one of us, that amber happened to be a color, an amber colored lens that made it easier for her to read and to see details on things that she was looking at. She had no idea, neither did I. Fortunately, they were able to change out her dark, very dark sunglasses. As I recall, she might have kept those for certain instances, but she was singing my praises every time I saw her because I suggested the amber lenses. Well, it wasn't me. I just happened to pick up on something that the doctor mentioned, or that actually one of the assistants mentioned. That particular color distinction does not necessarily help all people with all types of vision loss. That would not, for example, really make much difference for me. I've tried a number of different colored lenses, especially after what Mary found, and that doesn't necessarily help me to the degree that it did her. But for her, that was a life changer. And so that brings us to talking about some other technologies that are used by people with disabilities, particularly vision disabilities. Next, I wanted to talk about technology differences. And I wanted to share an experience that I had with some software that we use at work. We went to a new version of a student information system that we use. I'm going to try not to mention company names because I don't want to call anyone out or say anything negative about any particular company, because this is a common thing that we run into, not just with this company. But when we migrated to this new version of this student information system, I was having difficulty. The enlarging software that I use wasn't tracking properly. It didn't move with the cursor. And so I was constantly having to move my mouse around to find where the cursor or the pointer was where I was typing in text because it wasn't tracking properly. And the response that we got from the company was, well, it is fully ADA compliant because we tested it with JAWS. JAWS is a screen reader program that's used by speak the screen to you. JAWS is not a screen magnifier. So for any of us with low vision, JAWS is not the answer. JAWS would force me to essentially close my eyes or turn off my screen and rely totally and completely on audio cues. The screen magnifier that I use has a bit of screen reading built into it for those who are low vision. And so it's designed specifically for someone with low vision, and it's enhanced, or I'm drawing a blank on the word that I'm looking for, but it's designed specifically to work well for a person with low vision, not necessarily a person with no vision. And so their response of, well, we tested it with JAWS, is an example of how they thought one size fit all, and it doesn't. What we ended up doing, I did some research and I found that there was a program that merged this screen reader and screen magnifier together because they didn't necessarily play well together. I couldn't just install JAWS and have it work well with the screen magnifier that I was using. It needed this bridge program, if you will, that made the two work together. So we did find that solution, and it works fairly well for me. JAWS talks a lot more than I need it to. It's often chitter-chattering, and I've gotten to where I ignore it. People around me can't believe that my computer talks as much as it does. I actually saw someone on campus the other day who I had not met before. They're one of our security people, I believe they work for security. And they said that they'd walked by and heard my computer chitter-chattering, and it kind of reminded them of like a weather station where there's just a lot of background. If you've ever listened to a weather radio, it's constantly giving you weather updates and constantly chitter-chattering in the background, and that's what it reminded them of. I don't even notice it anymore. I often will hit the control key to shut it up, but that's an example of how really I've got technology on my computer that I don't even really need, but because I had to use the two of them together in order to get the screen magnifier to track properly, I had to sort of conform to that way of doing things, not out of choice, but out of necessity and dictation by someone else. And that was part of what I wanted to point out here, is that people with disabilities like to have choices too. They don't all do things. We don't all do things the same way. That brings me to the challenge that I faced this week with my system. My laptop for work automatically updated to Windows 11, and I had been testing Windows 11 and had found that there were some challenges with accessibility. It turns out, and again, I don't want to call companies out, but this one I can't really bring up without talking about it being Windows 11 or Microsoft. That's not to downplay Microsoft at all. I'm simply stating facts here. They have decided in the newest release of Windows 11 to disable, if you will, to not allow a feature where you could hover over your taskbar, which is the bar across the bottom on a Windows screen. You could hover over that taskbar with your programs that were open, and if you had multiple windows, for example, multiple emails open in Outlook, it would display those emails in a list format that was pretty easy to navigate with a screen magnifier using your mouse. they've now decided, and this started a couple releases ago, but they had a workaround that enabled you to go back to the list view. They've now decided to disable that workaround. It no longer works. And so you have to have the multiple emails or multiple instances of a program displayed in thumbnail views, which I suppose for someone with vision, they can look at that and quickly see which email it is. But if you're using a screen magnifier, those thumbnails become very pixelated. For those who may not know what pixelated means, it's when you look at a letter and it's a bunch of dots. You've zoomed in on it so much that the letter's no longer readable. It's just a bunch of random dots that form up that letter. These thumbnail images, when you zoom in a great deal using screen magnification software, they become very pixelated or very dotted. And so it makes it hard to even begin to distinguish which one is which. Furthermore, if you're moving from one thumbnail to another and you don't see where the end of the thumbnail list or the thumbnail grouping is, because it's not a list, they're side by side. If you move your mouse off of that grouping of thumbnails, it collapses them. And so now you have to start over from the very beginning. That doesn't make it particularly useful for someone who uses a mouse to navigate around the screen. Well, their workaround is to ungroup the instances of a program. They did have a setting that you can ungroup them, which does make it at least technically usable for someone using a mouse or a screen magnifier. However, what it does is it lists the tags associated with each one of those instances next to the icon. So now you've got a big long description on your taskbar instead of just the icon. And those get listed side by side on the taskbar and fill up your taskbar very quickly. And so it has significantly degraded my ability to perform tasks at work as quickly as I could before, which was still slower than a lot of people. But now it's slowed me down even more. And that was sort of the impetus for this podcast, because their response is, well, use a screen reader. Just, tab through or use your cursor keys and use a screen reader to read each one of those little thumbnails, which again is a much slower way of going about it. Some people might think that's just a preference, using magnification versus screen reading, but think of yourself. Can you read something quicker than you can listen to someone read it out loud to you? Probably so. And it's very similar for a person using screen magnification versus screen reading. I don't want to belabor that point. I don't want to make it a negative thing. It's just another example of one size does not fit all. I use different technologies for different applications. For example, we've talked about screen readers versus screen magnifiers, but I also have reading glasses. I have a lighted magnifier, which is the same level of magnification as my glasses, but it's a handheld magnifier. Very, very strong magnification. It's about a plus 40. So not something you can just go down to your local Walmart and pick up. But I use them for different applications. Sometimes it's handier to have glasses that are on my face. Sometimes it's handier to have that light, if it's a dark environment, with the magnifier that I can hand hold. I also have mounted telescopes that are mounted in a pair of glasses. At some point I may bring some of these items on the podcast. I didn't think about having some of them available tonight, but this is already going a little longer than I intended it to anyway. I may do a demonstration of some of these. So I have a mounted telescope, which works great for applications where I want my hands free for writing or for doing something else. It also works great if I'm in a sporting event or at a concert or in a meeting where I want to be able to read the what's projected on the wall, the slides that are projected on the wall. The telescope is something that I use for distance reading as opposed to my reading glasses, which are very, very close up. The magnification is so strong that I have to have the paper within a couple of inches of my eyes to read it. Actually, less than a couple inches. It's about an inch or less. Sometimes I'm rubbing my nose on paper. It's so close. But then the telescopes are used for distance work. I also have a handheld telescope. That works better in other instances. And so I use them both. I use the handheld one as well as the mounted telescope, depending on what I'm using it for. I also have a closed circuit TV magnifier that I use to read certain things. It will magnify much more than even my glasses do. And so if something is too small to read with my glasses, I may have to resort to the closed circuit TV magnifier, which is not very portable. But it works great in certain instances. I also use my phone to zoom in. You can use the camera on your phone and use the zoom feature on the camera with the pinch on an iPhone to expand it. Is another great way that I've found to magnify if I'm in a store, something's too small to read with my glasses, or maybe I don't have my glasses out, my phone is more handy. I can zoom in on the label of a product that I'm purchasing. So that's another example of technology. We've talked about screen reading versus screen magnification. On an iPhone, those two are the screen screen magnifier would be zoom, or the screen reader would be voiceover on an Apple iPhone. And I presume, I've never used an Apple computer, only the iPhone and an iPad, but I presume that they're the same on the Apple computer because I think it uses the same operating system. So, but one doesn't necessarily do all. I use both voiceover and screen magnification, the zoom feature, as well as high contrast in certain instances, or reverse contrast, so that instead of being white on black, it's black on white. Sometimes, depending on the image or what you're looking at, it's easier to see it one way versus the other. Just make sure I'm not skipping anything here. Yep, we've talked about that. Okay, as I bring this in for a landing, the last point I wanted to make is that it's okay if you know someone with a particular condition, whether it's a vision limitation, someone with a chronic illness. Some of my fellow podcasters do chronic illness podcasts. It is totally okay and appropriate and often appreciated if you come across a technology or a technique that has worked for you or for someone else that you know in a similar situation. It's always helpful. It's the only way that we find out about other solutions. However, be aware that even though that technology or that technique may be the greatest thing since sliced bread for one person, it may not work for someone else. It may not even be a usable solution for someone else with a similar condition. The perfect example of that is my friend with the colored lenses. It worked great for her. It was a life changer for her. It would not make that much of a difference for me. It might not even help me. Might not necessarily make anything worse, but it might not help me. So that's something to be aware of. If you're a person who doesn't have limitations and you share something with someone else, they may not receive it with the excitement that you did. Doesn't mean that they don't appreciate the suggestion, but it just may not be as helpful for them as it is for you or for someone that you know. I'm going to be sharing a technology that I'm very excited about getting. It actually came in early. It was supposed to take 4 to 6 weeks, and I got notification this week that it's in. It only took about a week, so I will be picking that up later this week. I'll just give you a little teaser here. One of my future podcasts will definitely be demoing that new technology. If you're someone that I see in person, that I've shared what this technology is with you, don't do a spoiler alert. Don't share the ending of the movie, so to speak. But if you want to take a guess as to what this technology is and you don't know, drop that in the comments and I'll respond perhaps privately if you guess it correctly. But if you want to have a little fun with this, we can try to guess what technology I may be sharing. I may be sharing that as early as next week. We'll see how quickly I come up to speed with it, and I've got to figure out some things to actually use it on a podcast. But I'm excited about it. It's something that actually I saw online. Another friend of mine ended up getting it and loving it, and so I started looking into it, and I think it's going to be very exciting. But again, it may not work for everybody, and I know that it's not going to work for all situations. I know that going into it. It's not going to be the do-all, end-all. I'm not going to throw away all my other technologies that I use. It will just be another tool in my toolkit. And so with that, as we bring this in for a landing, I hope you've gotten value from this. If you have, let me know that in the comments. If you would like to be added to my email list, because I'm going to be starting to share out some private events, I may actually, depending on how this goes, I may do an early release as a private event of what this new technology is. So if you'd like to be added to my email list, either private message me with your email address or drop the word email in the comments and I will reach out to you to get your email address privately so that you don't have to share that publicly. And as always, I more than I can express, I appreciate you joining me and supporting these podcasts. If you have any ideas for future topics, I'm always open for that. Questions, comments, let me know that in the comments section or private message me. And with that, it seems like I'm forgetting something, but I'm drawing a blank on what it is. So with that, I will bring this in for a landing. And as always, thank you so much for joining me. I may or may not be able to do this podcast next week. I'm going to be traveling for work. I'm going to be at a conference. I'm going to try and jump on at the same time. But if I'm not able to, I will try to at least post something in the Facebook and Instagram threads to let you know that I'm not going to be able to jump on. Or if I have to change the time to a little earlier or a little later because of the conference, I'll let you know that. But my plan is to come on at approximately the same time next week. And so until then, make it a great week for those you come in contact with. Do something positive for someone around you. And have a blessed week and a great week ahead. Until we meet again, either on next week's live or on a random post this week. Take care and have a blessed week. Goodbye for now.